What we learn from history is that no one learns from history. Otto von Bismarck. Germany is the fourth largest economy on the planet, and the largest in Europe. It's an economic, political, cultural, and to a lesser extent, technological powerhouse, a force to be reckoned with. It's the birthplace of some of the greatest scientists, philosophers, and artists, as well as some of the worst monsters. This video can only scratch the surface of this nation. It's a story of the backwater outskirts of the Roman Empire that would rise together to become one of the most powerful nations on the planet, challenge other major powers, get crushed in the process, twice mind you, and then rise again. Germany is a construct of the modern age. While the concept of a nation-state is only 200 years, Germany is actually even younger than that. It's younger than Canada. It was formed in 1871. However, unlike Canada, there are written records that go well back, around the time of the Romans. However, the story goes back even further into the stuff of legend, when pre-Indo-European peoples lived on the continent. However, they were eventually overtaken by Indo-European peoples who were, by and large, far more advanced, similar to what happened to the Native Americans. Eventually, one group of Indo-Europeans, known as the Germanic peoples from what is now Sweden, would migrate into what is now Germany, becoming the predominant ethnic group that exists today, with some significant clashes with the Celtic people groups and most of all the Roman Empire. The Romans proved to be very formidable when it came to defeating the Celtic peoples in Gaul, what is now France, and Britannia in what is now Britain. However, the Germanic people proved to be far tougher to fight. The Roman general who led the charge during the most formative years of the invasion of Germania was known as Germanicus, hence the name Germany. However, they were never really fully able to subjugate this area. This was in sharp contrast to what is now France, England, the Italian peninsula, North Africa, and even Egypt. The most epic military fail in Roman history was probably the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, when Germanic tribes, led by one guy called Arminius, would eventually defeat the Roman onslaught. Arminius would eventually become the namesake of Germany in many languages around the world, such as Armenia in Arabic. So you have Germanicus and you have Arminius. Now you know where the names come from. Speaking of language, this played a profound role in the German language itself. German, along with Swedish and Dutch, and to a lesser extent English, are Germanic languages because, in part, the Romans were not able to conquer them, unlike, say, the Romance languages of Italian, French, and Spanish, areas that were more easily subjugated by the Romans and influenced by Latin. During the early modern age, many German nationalists would use the story of Arminius fighting against the Roman Empire as a rallying cry for a united German identity, fighting against far larger forces. Oftentimes, the Roman Empire was replaced with a newer enemy, such as France, Russia, or the United States. However, in more recent years, this has become more taboo, and we're gonna find out why when we learn about some of the military endeavors of Germany. Nonetheless, Arminius is still sometimes seen as an icon for football clubs. A little bit better than for warfare, I should say. Anyway, going back to Roman times, the Huns, or nomadic steppe peoples, would rampage through Eastern Europe, pushing out many Germanic tribes, who in turn would invade the Roman Empire. These Germanic people groups were not a united nation-state. They oftentimes fought amongst each other and fought against the Romans. The most notable at the time were the Visigoths, who eventually sacked Rome, leading to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. But at the end of the day, the most powerful of them were the Franks, who would take over much of what is now France and part of Germany. The larger-than-life figure, Charlemagne, became the most powerful man in Europe after the sacking of Rome. He had also spread Christianity through education and violence to various other Germanic people groups, such as the Saxons, setting up the foundation for Christianity in Northern Europe. When he died, the Carolingian Empire that he founded would split up between his sons, with West and East Francia, which in turn would become France and Germany respectively at a later state in history, along with a buffer state between them. After a while, East Francia would eventually morph into the Holy Roman Empire, which, as Voltaire said, was not holy, was not Roman, and was not an empire. It was really just a loose collection of duchies and city-states and countless other governmental structures that just kind of coagulated into some sort of quasi-state, if you could even call it a state. We oftentimes think of Northern Europe today as being more developed than Southern Europe, but at the time this just wasn't the case. Germany, if you could call it Germany back then, was at this point still a backwater. However, there was the Hanseatic League, which set up various trading posts around northern Germany and parts of Scandinavia, all around the Baltic Sea, which did bring in some commercial prosperity around the region. Speaking of the Baltic states, one state that would emerge would be the Teutonic Order of Knights, which eventually became the precursor of Prussia. And Prussia was the precursor of the modern state of Germany. Overall, by this time, the power of the Catholic Church was waning due to poor leadership, due to the bubonic plague around the 1300s. On top of that, corruption was rampant within much of the Catholic Church. This led one friar by the name of Martin Luther to set up the Protestant Reformation. Now, Martin Luther didn't initially plan to break off from the Catholic Church. He simply had a list of grievances, and the Catholic Church excommunicated him for it. As a result, he set up his own branch of Protestantism known as Lutheranism, which would play a profound role in German modern history. However, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, as the Protestant Reformation and Counter-Reformation led to the 30 Years' War between Catholics and Protestants. This was the last major religious war in Europe, and the bloodshed was just unbelievable. In some parts of what are now Germany, a third of the people died. The war was so brutal that, with the exception of the Balkans, Europeans by and large just tended to ditch religious wars altogether. As a result of this, many in what is now Germany preferred to live in harmony. Actually, just kidding, they preferred to fight over national identity instead. The bloodshed between Catholics and Protestants led to the Peace of Westphalia, which many consider to be the foundation of modern international relations. This set up the idea of sovereign nation-states with concrete borders. Borders that other nations could not simply steal. And this system sort of kind of worked, but sort of didn't work. We'll find out more in the future. I'll elaborate. Napoleon, for example, didn't really agree to the idea of borders, and he just invaded a whole bunch of borders during the 1800s. Napoleon was eventually defeated twice, and the French Revolution did spread notions of liberalism and nationalism, even though it did so with a tremendous amount of bloodshed. Napoleon also, by and large, destroyed the Holy Roman Empire during his conquests, and set up the Confederation of the Rhine, which was a buffer state and puppet state, protecting them from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Prussia. After Napoleon's defeat, the Congress of Vienna was set up to roll back the rise of nationalism and liberalism, and install more monarchical rule and autocracy. They also set up the Confederation of Germany. However, many people in this region were rather fed up of being the whipping boys of both the French and the Austrians. Eventually, after numerous minor revolutions and numerous sets of reforms were made, this led to a period of time in the region whereby there was a large influx of scientists, philosophers, artists, musicians, and others. They contributed to the foundations of modern German culture that many of us admire today. Eventually, Prussia, under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck, would unite many of the Germanic states against the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and especially France, humiliating France's Napoleon III, Napoleon's grandson, during the Franco-Prussian War. This led to a source of national pride in what was now Germany, and the Reichstag was set up, a sort of quasi-parliament. At the end of the day, the Emperor of Germany had the final say in the German Empire, but nonetheless, there were more freedoms that were not seen in many other parts of Europe. However, Bismarck was not successful in uniting all the Germanic peoples. For example, Denmark and Luxembourg preferred to stay independent. Bismarck also set up the foundations of Realpolitik, also known as realism in international relations. This is the idea that the world is governed by power dynamics rather than by lofty ideas. Realism is not necessarily pro-war, but it's not anti-war either. It's just a framework that claims to tell the world as it actually is rather than how our ideas and lofty notions would like it to be. Bismarck also set up the foundations of the modern German welfare state, and despite his reluctance, he did set up a conference in Berlin over the colonization of Africa. Many Germans, despite Otto von Bismarck's wishes, wanted to set up colonies on the African continent, particularly in Namibia and Tanzania, as well as a few Pacific Island nations. This was based off of the British and French models in Africa, and like the British and French models, the Germans were pretty terrible in the way that they treated their native African populations, particularly in Namibia. Bismarck's time as Chancellor would come to an end when the Emperor's son, Kaiser Wilhelm II, came to the throne, and due to disagreements, Otto von Bismarck was kicked out. Kaiser Wilhelm, by and large, proved to be a total disaster. He entered World War I on behalf of the other major quasi-Germanic state, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. At the end of the day, this war was incredibly bloody and essentially pointless. After losing, Germany was forced to sign the humiliating Treaty of Versailles, which pretty much put all the blame on Germany, and along with extreme financial penalties. Along with this, Germany was forced to give up its colonies in Africa and the Pacific. The Weimar Republic was set up, however, it faced hyperinflation as it had to pay enormous amounts of reparations to France. As a result of this, it had to print out money in order to do so, resulting in the devaluation of the currency. When the Great Depression hit, Germany was hit particularly hard, and this economic hardship led to the rise of a guy with a tiny mustache. I'm not going to delve too much into World War II, as you almost certainly have heard the story countless times. Hitler took over Sudetenland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and then invaded Poland, prompting a declaration of war from Britain and France. Germany quickly took over the Low Countries, Denmark, Norway, and even humiliated France, taking them over in like 3 weeks. Along with this, they allied with Italy, took over much of North Africa, and invaded the Soviet Union. Eventually, the combined forces of the Soviet Union, the British Empire, and the United States defeated the Germans. The Soviet Union played an incredibly heroic role in defeating the Germans, but at the same time, this led to one oppressor being replaced with another. Overall, the Soviets had taken over much of Eastern Europe as a result of this. In the wake of the bloodshed, we found out the true horrors of what happened to Jews, Roma people, political prisoners, gays, disabled people, and others that the, let's just say, Germans at the time thought were subhuman. I'm not going to say the name of the actual party because then I'll just get demonetized. Anyway, during this period, many scientists from Germany had already fled to the United States. Many of these scientists, after all, were Jewish, escaping persecution, the most famous of which was Einstein. Another German scientist was von Braun, whose invention of the V-2 rocket, which was used to bomb Britain during the Battle of Britain, was eventually adopted by the Americans, and he was pivotal to the moon landing. This was indicative of a larger trend, one in which the premier scientific and technological power was no longer Germany, but the United States. Many of the war criminals were put on trial. However, it proved to be very difficult to completely disengage the German economy from its past, given the fact that so many corporations were entrenched into the war machine. Hugo Boss was used for uniforms for German soldiers, Volkswagen was used to produce many military vehicles, the list goes on. However, the Germans were by and large very apologetic for their past crimes, and during the Luxembourg Agreement, Germany agreed to pay reparations to Israel for the atrocities committed against German Jews, along with the Jews of other European nations. Overall, Germany has a sense of collective guilt, which has been very controversial given that most Germans today were not alive during the 30s and 40s and had nothing to do with the crimes committed by previous generations. The British, French, and American parts of occupied Germany eventually became West Germany, and the Soviet part became East Germany. Berlin, situated in East Germany, however, was split between West and East Berlin. The Soviets tried to blockade Western Berlin, but eventually lost due to the Berlin airlift. France was still paranoid of Germany at the time for obvious reasons on top of that, which added to some of the, let's just say, tensions. For this reason, they set up the European Coal and Steel Community, basically making France and Germany reliant on each other's coal and steel production. Given that these are two essential military resources, or at least coal was at the time, this became a sort of way of making the two countries interdependent. This set up the foundations for European trade and the European Union. This transitional period led to the European Economic Community, allowing for free trade, along with the European Atomic Energy Community, allowing for nuclear energy. This made European economies far more integrated and less likely to engage in wars. And speaking of wars, let's go to the military front. The United States set up the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, along with Canada and most of its liberal democracy capitalist allies. And West Germany would eventually join the alliance. The initial purpose of NATO was to keep the Americans in Europe, the Russians out of Europe, and the Germans down. As time has progressed, that last part has become far, far less relevant. The Soviet Union responded to West Germany joining NATO with their own alliance, the Warsaw Pact, which was for self-defense, even though it literally led to the invasions of its own member states, such as was seen in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. This suppression led many Eastern European countries to share a deep-seated disdain for Moscow, far more than they had for Berlin. Speaking of Berlin, Western Berlin had become far more prosperous than Eastern Berlin, and this was a deep source of resentment and insecurity for the Soviet Union. When the last leader of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, set up Glasnost and Perestroika, a set of economic and political reforms, this led to more relaxed regulations and more economic freedom as well as political expression. However, it also meant that reform in the Soviet Union led many people in the Eastern Bloc seeing just how much prosperous and free the Western Bloc was. This led to the quick dismantling of the Warsaw Pact and communism in Eastern Europe. The Berlin Wall fell, and 2 years later the Soviet Union collapsed, officially ending the Cold War. Not with an extinction event, but rather with people partying on the streets. Much of this happened under the leadership of Helmut Kohl, who oversaw Germany from the 70s to the 90s, and oversaw unification. Helmut Kohl had vehemently fought against communism. He'd also set up a very strong foundation with France, and that would become the foundation of the European Union. To this day, Germany and France are basically the de facto leaders of the continent. While Germany struggled with integrating the poor eastern portions of the country with the more prosperous western portions, it nonetheless is a very high-functioning country. As an ally of the United States in NATO, Germany did engage in certain US-led military interventions, namely in Afghanistan and the aftermath of 9/11 under Article 5. However, it stayed out of the Iraq War based off of the fact that the Iraq War was based off of bullshit pretenses, to put it lightly. Germany was also the main leader during the Euro financial crisis, in which it garnered a great deal of resentment from southern European nations like Greece. Germany has also brought in a large number of Syrian and other Middle Eastern migrants during the Syrian civil war and other Middle Eastern conflicts, which some viewed as a sign of compassion, and some viewed as a source of cheap labor, and others saw as a source of destruction for the German identity. This eventually has given to the rise of right-wing populism. Now, overall, Germany has had a fairly pacifist stance when it comes to its foreign policy, given how militant its past has been. In the aftermath of World War II, they by and large have tried their best to avoid wars. They also tried to make amends with Russia, the successor of the Soviet Union, or at least the main successor, and this didn't work out too well as Germany has become very dependent on Russian gas. On top of that, the Germans rejected Ukraine's bid to join NATO in 2008. Due to historical guilt towards crimes committed against Russians, even though Germans also committed crimes against Ukrainians. This has become quite a, let's just say, shit show for lack of a better word. This has led to a major reassessment. After all, Germany is no longer a belligerent power, invading its neighbors constantly. If anything, Germany has provided the role of the protector of Europe, given that it is the de facto leader of the entire continent. Save for UK, which is doing their own thing, and France, which by and large still insists that it's the most powerful. And that's the story so far, but the story doesn't end there. It continues and will continue long after everyone watching this is dead. The peoples of this land have been sandwiched between the middle of Europe, at the crossroads, with very few natural barriers, making them susceptible to invasions, and this in turn has made them ironclad. It's a tale of iron and blood, but also a tale of literature, philosophy, music, science, and a whole bunch of other accomplishments that are just staggering. This country has more baggage than almost any other major power on the planet. However, it's also a country that has done far more to address some of its ugliest aspects of its history than any other. So if you're from Germany, you can at least take credit for that. To me, it all stems back to that epic battle of the Teutoburg Forest. I can only imagine what those Germanic soldiers would have thought if we could tell them the series of events that would arise from their victory. After a long fought battle, they returned back to their village, washed off their axes, and settled back home. If only they knew.